So let's hear it again for Jimmy Harrod. I'm sure we're all familiar with the line from the movie and the TV show Mission Impossible, right? With the beginning that says, "Good morning, Jim. Your mission, should you decide to accept it, is," and then he got his mission, and then the little tape recorder would blow up or whatever. And I don't know what the current guy does. I don't know how he gets his stuff. But imagine if God said to you every morning, "Good morning, Gail. Your mission, should you decide to accept it, is," or "Good morning, Dawn. Your mission, should you decide to accept it, is." And imagine that every morning that God is calling us to accept our mission. And of course, for every single one of us, that mission is different. Some of us have had missions thrust upon us through experiences that we've had in life. Others have found it through our talents or, that inner yes that has called us out in many different ways, which I've talked about over the last couple of weeks. So there are many different ways that we discover what our mission is. And sometimes, as I said, they're thrust upon us. Like biblically, Adam and Eve, they didn't choose to get thrown out of the Garden of Eden, but they were sent on this pilgrimage and they were sent on this new course by being thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And there was the angel with the sword saying, "Nope, can't go back." As it is in our life, sometimes we're thrust upon a path and the way to go back is close to us, isn't it? And it may not be something we've chosen, but it's something that we are now on the road to. When Jonah was called by God, he was called to save and to preach to the people of Nineveh. And he didn't like the people of Nineveh. So instead of doing what he was guided to do, he ended up running away. And you know the story of Jonah. What happened to him? He ended up swallowed by a giant fish, didn't he? And then till he came back and he fulfilled that purpose. He fulfilled his mission. He fulfilled his pilgrimage, if you will. When Moses was called by the burning bush, by God through the burning bush, instead of saying, "Sure, I'll follow and I'll do whatever you ask," he says, "Why don't you pick somebody else? I'm not a very good speaker. I stutter when I talk. Pick my brother. Do someone else," right? Again, there's the fact that Moses was chosen to lead the people out of Israel, in truth, he really was the perfect person to do it, wasn't he? Because he was a Jew and he understood what they were experiencing, and he was part of the household of Pharaoh. So he had that connection. And when you look at it from a distance, you can see that Moses was the perfect person to have led the people of Israel out of Egypt. Sometimes the people who are on the mission or the pilgrimage are unlikely candidates. And sometimes our mission, as I said, can be thrust upon us through wounding. So think of victims of domestic violence. Many of them, not many of them, but a few of them take on the cause of speaking out and caring for others who have been in a similar situation. Mothers Against Drunk Driving was formed by a mother who lost her child in a car accident because of a drunk driver. Think of the gay and lesbian people who have been persecuted, have then taken on the role of being leaders in that community and leaders to begin to change things. So sometimes our mission and our pilgrimage is sort of pushed upon us through our wounding. And in that case, we then become wounded healers. Rumi said that the wound is where the light gets in. So we may be wounded, but it's also this place of light that then may direct us. So this morning, I wanted to call out the life of Harriet Tubman. She was born in Maryland in 1820, and her parents were both slaves, although later her father became freed. And so I've been immersing myself in the story of the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman's life in honor of Black History Month. And I kind of want to set the scene because I think the slaves started to come over from the West Africa in the 1700s, and around 1820, around when she was born, it started to become unpopular to bring in the slave ships, even though they were still coming in. And Harriet, she had older brothers and sisters, and many times the slaves would be farmed out to other people in the community. So rather than work on your own plantation or your own farm, you would be sent out, and then the people who were using you would pay the slave owner. And Harriet was farmed out quite frequently when she was a child. And she was hired by this woman who was extremely abusive, and beat her and abused her terribly. She had scars on her back from being whipped by this woman because she didn't know how to dust properly. And rather than the woman showing her how to do it, she just thought, well, if she beats her, she'll figure it out. So you have this trauma that's happening, not only because you're not free and you're this slave, but because the slave ships weren't coming in as much. Then the slave owners in Maryland, who had slaves for a couple of generations, decided that one of the ways that they could make money is to sell their slaves to the South, which meant breaking up families. And up to that point, they really hadn't done it that much. They had kind of stayed in the same area. So even though you're under this incredible trauma, at least your family is somehow nearby. But what happened was Harriet's older sisters were sold to a chain gang to the South. Now imagine the trauma of being a mother, being a younger sister, being a father, and watching your child be dragged off by a chain gang to the South, to never see them again, to never know what their fate is, and the extreme, again, the trauma of that had to have been just too much. So one of the things that Harriet learned to do is that because she was being farmed out, if you will, she learned how to somehow do that, but then make enough money that she could pay her owners and then kind of pick and choose where she went. And as a result, she ended up having a lot of freedom. So she could sort of not come and go exactly, but she could disappear for a few days. And, you know, they didn't exactly know where she was all the time. So she had a different vision or things that were happening with her. She also was extremely spiritual and religious. She was from the Ashanti people who had a real connection to the earth and to spirit, and just kind of had a real mysticism about them. She also was, she would talk to God like constantly, have these conversations with God, asking God to guide her, to direct her, and she just was constantly in this place. And then one time when she was in a store, the store owner was after somebody, and so he had a 2-pound weight that he went to throw at this guy who was running away, and instead of hitting him, he hit her in the head. And of course it did a great deal of damage. She had extreme headaches. She had this condition where she would like pass out or fall asleep at a moment's notice and then come back again. But there was another, and she would have seizures. That was another part of what happened. But another thing that happened because of this is she had these visions. She had these incredible visions and experiences of God. And she would talk about them, and she would go into these altered states of seeing God and being in that presence. So this is her life. You know, and there's always this tension of, am I going to lose my brothers? Am I going to lose my sisters? Am I going to lose my cousins? Are they going to go away? And the way that the system worked then is that some of the slave owners would, upon their deaths, they would free their slaves, or most of the time they would say, well, when you're 45, you can be free, because the lifespan back then wasn't that long anyway. And her father ended up being free, but her mother was not. And because her mother was not, it meant that she would always be a slave, because As a child, you took on whatever your mother had rather than your father. So she finds out that her brothers, her older brothers, are going to be sold to the South. And this is when her mission began. This is when her pilgrimage began. We can imagine God saying to her, "Good morning, Harriet. Your mission, should you decide to accept it, is to escape and to help others do the same." And so she did. There was this whole system called the Underground Railroad. It was very secretive. There were abolitionists who were a part of it, Methodists, Quakers, both black and white. And you would get to one place and you wouldn't know where the next place was until you got to the first one. So there was this whole intricate system. And she and her brothers escaped, the ones who were going to be sold to the South, except there were also bounty hunters that were, would track you down. So the brothers saw an ad in the paper that said there was a reward out for them. So they went back. And rather than go back, she continued on and she went to Pennsylvania. And actually, most of the slaves ended up in Canada because of the bounty hunters that were following them. But I want to read to you what she said when she got into Pennsylvania. She said, "When I found that I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if it was the same person. There was such glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." Wonderful story, right? And she could have ended it there. She could have stayed in Pennsylvania or gone on to Canada, but instead, she went back, and she went back, and she went back, and she went back numerous times to free her, to help her siblings escape, to help her cousins escape, to help so many other people escape. And she did it again and again and again. And she became known as the Moses of her people. During the Civil War, she worked for the Union Army, and she was an armed scout and a spy. She started out as a cook, and then she ended up as an armed scout and a spy. And during the Civil War, she helped liberate 700 slaves in South Carolina as a part of the Combahee River Raid. So in many ways, Harriet Tubman was chosen. She was able to take on this mission. She was able to take on this pilgrimage because it wasn't just an intellectual thing for her. She experienced it, right? She lived it. She felt it, both of her siblings being taken and living in this horrendous conditions. It was such a part of her being, and her connection to God was so strong that she was a leader in a way that probably no one else could have been. It's the same with Moses, right? He witnessed the suffering of his people, and it was him who was able to then lead the people out of Israel and out of bondage. In The Soul of the Pilgrim, Christine Paintner said that we recognize that we don't know what will happen on our journey. We don't understand how we will be changed by this experience. And when you're walking on a path without a map, it's impossible to plan ahead. And so again, there's that connection to God. And Harriet said, "Always remember that you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach the stars, to change the world." So these are very inspiring people and stories. And I think that right now that there's another group that is being called to a mission. Your mission, should you decide to accept it, and that is the students in Parkland, Florida. I'm sure that many of you know, as we follow the news, that there was yet again another shooting in another school. 17 students were killed, and it was an AK-15, I believe, that was used by another student who had been expelled. And in many ways, just as Harriet Tubman was the person who could speak and lead and make change. In the same way Moses could lead and make change, I think that what I'm hearing from the students in particular in Parkland, Florida, they are being pushed into this mission. They are being pushed into this pilgrimage, and not by their own choosing. I want to share with you the words of Emma Gonzalez. She's one of the students. You may have seen it on CNN. And she spoke, you wouldn't call it a rally, but they were all together. And I want to share with you her words because they're extremely profound and prophetic, and I can hear the voice of this generation, this group, being called to a mission. Every single person up here today, all these people should be home grieving. But instead, we are up here standing together because if all our government can do is send thoughts and prayers, then it's time for the victims to be the change that we need to see. In Florida, to buy a gun, you do not need a permit, you do not need a gun license, and once you buy it, you don't need to register it. You do not need a permit to carry a concealed rifle or shotgun, and you can buy as many guns as you want at one time. We do not understand why it should be harder to make plans with our friends on weekends than it is to buy an automatic weapon. When adults tell me that I have the right to own a gun, all I hear is my right to own a gun outweighs your student's right to live. Maybe the adults have gotten used to saying it is what it is, but it's us students. If us students have learned anything, it's that if you don't study, you will fail. And in this case, if you actively do nothing, people continually end up dead. So it's time to start doing something. She shared how one candidate received $30 million from the NRA for his candidacy. And she said, okay, so that in 2018 only, that means that it comes to $5,800 per person who was killed. To every politician who is taking donations from the NRA, shame on you. If your money was as threatened as us, would your first thought be, how is this going to affect my campaign? The people in the government who were voted into power are lying to us, and us kids seem to be the only ones who notice. Politicians who sit in their gilded House and Senate seats funded by the NRA telling us that nothing could have been done to prevent this, and we call BS. They say tougher gun laws do not decrease gun violence. They say a good guy with a gun stops a bad guy with a gun. We say BS. They say guns are just tools like knives and are dangerous as cars. They say no laws could have prevented the hundreds of senseless tragedies that have occurred, and that us kids don't know what we're talking about, that we're too young to understand, and how the government works, we call BS. If you agree, register to vote, contact your congresspeople, and get them a piece of your mind. So when you hear these words, or when I hear these words, I hear a similar energy. I hear a similar voice that probably came through Harriet Tubman. And it's coming through these kids because they have suffered. Just as Harriet Tubman suffered. They're suffering and they're scared and they want change. And we seem as adults to be stuck in this thing of being unable to move forward. And so I think it's the voice of these kids that is going to help move us forward. And I, for one, am grateful to them for speaking out and for encouraging the rest of us. And for encouraging the rest of us to move forward, because we can stand behind kids, right? I mean, how can you not stand behind kids? How can you not stand in their favor and move with them and move in this energy? So Again, the different missions that come to us come in different ways. And yeah, they can come through a talent and a yes and something that we love doing, but many times our mission comes through us because we're wounded in some way. And it is that wounding then that calls us out to do something, to take action and to take leadership, to have that mission and to have that pilgrimage. So I would like to close in a prayer and hold those kids that lost their lives, to hold all of this that has been going on in a higher mind, in a higher purpose. Just as Harriet Tubman said that God directed her every step of the way, we know that God too can direct us every step of the way. So let's just take a moment to become still. And so we begin with the sadness and the tragedies that happen over and over again. And I invite you just to take a deep breath to that. To release it, to let it go. And now if you would breathe into your heart. And as you exhale, send love and kindness and compassion to all who are affected by this latest situation. And Rumi said, it is through the wounding that the light enters. So I'm going to invite you to take a deep breath again and let the light enter. And so we are being called to a higher place. Because your mission, should you decide to accept it, is to be a voice for change. So we bless all those souls who have lost their lives, recognizing that life cannot end. And we surround the families and the loved ones and the community, everyone who was affected. May the healing balm of God, of Spirit, of their families, of the world surround them and lift them. And may there be meaning. May there be meaning in this. So we turn our thoughts to the place where we're stuck, where things don't seem to be able to move forward. And just as Harriet Tubman called on that presence of God every moment, so we too call on the presence of God to move us from this stuck place that we have been in. For the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. So may we be called to listen. May we be called to action. May we be called to kindness, to compassion, to mission. For Richard Bach said, here is a test to find out if your mission on earth is finished. And if you are alive, it isn't. So know that you have a part to play in this grand scheme of life. And it is for this awareness and in the name and through the power of the living Spirit of truth that we say thank you and amen.